Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on inventory management through the supply chain. This is being pre-recorded as a narrated set of slides, and in case the lecture doesn't take place, it means that you will be able to watch this via the KLE pages. Now, what we're going to be looking at in today's lecture is we're going to be looking at how inventory, how materials are managed through the global supply chain. And essentially what we're going to be doing is looking at the basics of purchasing and inventory management and of stock holding and different types of inventory management through the supply chain. We're going to first of all look at the important area of balancing customer service, trying to provide inventory materials when and where required, with demand management, because obviously there are issues sometimes that we cannot predict demand or it's unexpected, but we can't hold too much stock. So we're going to look at that balancing act first of all. Then we're going to move on to look at different types of inventory and stock holding, and we're going to compare and contrast traditional economic order quantity, EOQ on the slide, with forms of requirements planning such as materials requirements planning and enterprises resources planning. These are all acronyms that are widely used by professionals in supply chain. And then we're going to look at how that contrasts with the idea of just-in-time management, which you have probably heard of as well. Essentially, the basic theory fits for all types of inventory management. It's just that they're all just twists on a theme. So the principle and the basic stock control or inventory management theory we're going to cover still stands. Don't be put off by people who tell you, oh well, just-in-time management means that we reject theory and the ways we did it in the past. It's just as just-in-time management takes a particular approach and builds upon the basic theory to provide a more efficient and more time-based way of managing inventory through the supply chain. We're just going to mention at the end vendor managed inventory, which is where rather than the buyer managing the inventory, it's actually the seller, the person back in the supply chain, if you like, who manages inventory on behalf of their customers. And finally, we're going to summarize. There are quite a few readings for this week. You don't have to read them all, but these readings give you a really good insight. I would say just pick 2 or 3 of the core readings. I've actually added a reading to what was on the original reading list. This is the second one, Bamford and Forrester. For obvious reasons, I have a book as well in the area of operations management with 2 chapters that relate to what we're looking at today. The first chapter on basic resources management, enterprise resources management, and then chapter 6, which is looking at lean and just-in-time operations. Okay, now one of the things that we need to consider before we even think about inventory management is why we hold inventory in the system. We want to ensure that in our supply chain we have the right materials in the right quantity, that it's positioned in the right place, close to the customer, at the right time, from the right source, at the right quality, and at the right price. Now, as you can imagine, that's a difficult thing to achieve. So the quote we've got first of all from Walters is to say the overriding aim of logistics management, which is what we're looking at, moving material from one place to another in the most efficient way, is to help the organization achieve customer satisfaction. Now, the danger is that we think, oh, that's simple. We just hold lots of material and lots of inventory close to where the customer demand is. But of course, the problem is that becomes very costly, and we have a lot of obsolescence, a lot of stock holding, and it would push prices up for the customer. So although people, non-inventory management people, would say it's simple, just hold lots of materials and stock, we all know that that can't possibly be done because it will be through the ceiling in terms of costs. And so we need to think about demand planning, trying to anticipate where demand is We can look short term, we can look mid-range, 1 to 3 years ahead. Obviously short term is where we're responding to immediate orders or those that are in the pipeline. Mid-range is where we're trying to anticipate up to 3 years ahead what the demand will be and planning our capacity, our facilities and our employment numbers of people and so on to tackle that. And then finally long range is where we're looking over 3 years ahead, the strategic direction of our company moving forward. Okay, so it's all about this balance between sales and what we anticipate the demand to be, and we need a forecast, but then at the same time planning our production through the supply chain and also ensuring that we have materials in the right place at the right time. So it's very much a balancing act. Now, the basic theory essentially looks at that in some detail. So what we're now going to move on to is to think about inventory and stock holding. You know, it would be nice, wouldn't it, to hold zero inventory, but still satisfy the customer. But that's going to be very, very difficult. We have to hold stocks somewhere in the supply chain, somewhere in the pipeline. There has to be materials held. And we've got some of the reasons for that here. It acts as a buffer between different parts of the supply chain. You know, not everything can be totally synchronized. It's allowing for unexpected demand or irregular demand. Some people would argue that approaches such as just in time, which we're going to look at later on, is easier to practice where you have high and consistent demand. Hence, some would say, well, Toyota have high demands and mass manufacture, therefore it's fairly consistent. If we're a low volume, high variety producer, just in time is a lot more difficult to put in place. So we tend to hold more stock because there's a lot more any unexpected demand likely to occur. We've got other reasons that are listed there. I won't run through them all. I'll let you look through them. But one thing is bulk orders. Sometimes people think if we order in bulk, we'll get a cheaper price. And sometimes that's counterproductive because although you get a cheaper price, you end up having to spend money on storing materials and items, and very often that will deteriorate or go off or go bad or become obsolescent and has to be scrapped. So we have to be very, very careful with all of these things. Obviously the bottom one is important because when we look at international supply chain management, very often we have overseas suppliers, which means we have long lead times. Lead time is the time between placing an order and receiving the material that we've placed. So, you know, it's nice if our suppliers next door, because very often we can order at very short notice and still have demand satisfied. Whereas the reality is you often have to provide, there's a long pipeline, you have to provide quite a lot of notice for that order. Also, you have possible disruption. You probably have to ship in large containers and so on. And so there are a number of factors there, which means that inventory is held. So the title of logistics management, for example, is all about strategically and tactically moving material around the world from one place to another so that you don't overstock and run up costs, but you're able to actually satisfy demand at the other end. So if you think about organizations like Amazon, they're very well versed and very efficient in responding to customers' orders or consumers' orders, in fact, right at the end of the supply chain and delivering it with very short notice. So they have actually developed a lot of expertise in this area. One thing I always say to people at this stage is that don't think that this is something that's detached from your everyday life, because actually all of us are inventory managers. Now you might say, how does that work? Well, we all have to buy food and we all have to stock our kitchen cupboards, our refrigerators, buy loo roll, for example, to last through a period of time. And we all know consequences then if we run out of food or horror of horrors, run out of toilet paper in our home, that these things present problems. So actually the logic you apply to your shopping applies also to inventory management. By determining how much to buy, whether to bulk buy things, what quantity to buy, trying to ensure food doesn't go off and has to be thrown away. It's very much the sort of thing that we're looking at here. It's very much inventory management, and the principles you employ in your head are applied to global supply chains in logic and reasoning. Now, of course, some of you are much better at shopping and stock holding than others. Some people have managed to buy food very efficiently at relatively low cost with minimal waste and so on. Other people are not so good. They tend to overstock things. They tend to end up throwing food away. They end up with materials that they bought that they don't use and so on. And on the other side, there's some people who are always out of food. They go the other way. They haven't got enough in stock and they run up lots of costs of buying and ordering. Okay, so just think of yourselves that you are actually inventory management people when it comes to buying food, groceries, other household goods. Okay, so purchasing and inventory management, and as I say, you're all purchasing and inventory management people, is the art of ensuring you've got just enough stock to economically meet the demand commitments. That's external demand commitments from your customers, but also internal demand from different stages of production in your own organization. And the key word is there, economically meet. We can always buy in large quantity and satisfy demand, but we could put our organization out of business if we run up high costs of stock holding. So it's all about getting the balance right. Not too much, but not too little, just enough to economically mean we satisfy demand. Okay, now one concept that's widely used in inventory management is the idea of Pareto analysis. You may not have heard of this, but the idea is Pareto, by the way, was the Italian economist Alfredo Pareto, who first identified things like the distribution of wealth in society, the need to focus on the important items and so on. So this diagram here indicates that very typically when we look at the total number of items that we stock, that's the x-axis across the bottom, the percentage of stock items, we find that the top 20% of stock items very often account for as much as 80% of the value. So if you think about things that are in your kitchen cupboards, about your groceries and things you purchase, probably there's a small number of items that have high price labels, cost a lot of money, and what we tend to do with those, we tend to call them the A-class items in inventory management. Okay, so those are the important few, the top 20% of stock items that account for about 80% of total stock value. This is sometimes called the 80-20 rule. You can see why. It's 80% of the value is often accounted for by the important few 20% of stock items. Intermediately, we will have some items that are more or less equivalent value to their quantity. So say the next 15% of stock items typically might be worth 15% of the total value. And then we get the many items in an organization, such as an electronics factory. You might find all the little nuts, bolts, washers, little wires, and all the rest. There are many of these little items. They're very low value items. They're only perhaps 5% of the total value, but they account for probably 2/3 of the number of stock items that you hold. Now, clearly those items, there's not such a big penalty on holding more of those. And the reason why we do this categorization is that it tells you that, say, in an electronics factory, the expensive disk drives and expensive electronic materials that are supplied, sub-assemblies from suppliers and so on, are very high cost items. So therefore we need to control those and monitor them very, very closely. Those are the A-class items that require lots of attention. But there's not a lot of value in having such stringent tight control on the many C-class items because they're low value. Even if we double the amount of stock holding, it's only going to push up total value by 5%. We really want to just ensure that we're satisfied we've got a supply of those items and that we don't actually run out of them. We don't want to stop a factory simply because we haven't got a sticky label or a little washer that needs to be inserted into, say, a computer. Okay, so the Pareto analysis tells you that actually not every single item of stock is managed with the same amount of precision. The greatest value can be achieved by tight control of the A-class items, but then what we need to do is just ensure that we have a low-cost, fairly efficient system for managing C-class items. Okay, so moving on now, and well, just to indicate that's the rule of the important few and the trivial many. Moving on, we're going to look at the types of purchasing and inventory policies that are in place. And we can break these down into two areas. In fact, we have the conventional push type systems. This is where we look at demand that's coming into the future and push material through the system to actually satisfy demand at some point in the future. And we have the economic order quantity approach. There are two different ways of doing this. One is the reorder level policy, which is exactly what it means. In other words, you reorder more materials or more of a particular item when the stock level gets to a certain point. So you don't wait for it to run out, because obviously you might have a period of stock out during that time, but you actually reorder when your level hits a certain point, just like you would do in your kitchen cupboards. You know, if you see your cereal running down, you think, oh, we've almost run out of that. The level has come down. We'll reorder. We'll go out and buy some more. There is another approach. We're not really going to spend time on this, but the other approach is reorder cycle. And this is where you periodically look at what you need to buy. So the analogy with the kitchen cupboards is that when you decide to do your shopping, say if you shop once a week on a Saturday, you actually review how much food you've got, how much you've got, and then you determine what you need to buy to see you through the next period. So this is almost where you go around and produce a shopping list. You find that you need some more cereal, but when you have a look at, I don't know, your jam that you have, you realize that you've got plenty. There's no need to buy any more of that. Now, there is an alternative form of push system which is developed with the advance of computers, and it's called materials requirements planning, and we'll be looking at how that operates in a few minutes as well. But the other type of system is what we call a pull system. This is very much inspired by Japanese companies such as Toyota, and probably the one that we hear about the most is the just-in-time system and lean production, lean management systems. The idea of this, the idea of the pull, is that actually you don't anticipate demand into the future. What you actually do, the way in which materials is moved through the supply chain, is that when you use an item, that causes a pull to supply some more. So this is almost, if you like, once you've used something, you then pull some more through the system to replenish the stock. So you can see that it works slightly differently. The push system, you look at the demand into the future and you order in advance, whereas the pull system, in its most fundamental form, is the idea that you don't order anything until you actually use something. So you use one thing, you order one thing and pull it through. Now, those are the principles. Let's have a look at how they operate. Well, let's have a look at the theory behind them and how they operate. Okay, the economic order quantity, the idea is that we can represent this on a graph. We can look at the order quantity, that's the size of order that you're going to place. So, you know, do we order in small quantities or do we order in large quantities? When we're buying cereal for our kitchen cupboards, do we order a huge box of cereal, or do we order, you know, a sort of buy one get one free type offer in huge quantities? Obviously there the order quantity is quite high, but then we've got to actually store the item. So that can run up quite a lot of cost. If it's a refrigerated item, it costs money to refrigerate. We have to buy a fridge, perhaps a larger capacity fridge. Even if it's something that's non-perishable, we have to buy extra cupboards and storage space to store that in. So companies go through that same dilemma in terms of how much to order. Do they order a large quantity, or is it better to order in small quantities? Which means that if you order, say, a small packet of cereal, yes, it might cost a little bit more to buy, but actually the costs of holding and keeping it are much less. So that's the other axis, is the cost. So if we look at the cost of ordering, now one benefit of bulk purchasing, buying in large quantities, is that you only have to place the order once. You only have one lot of transportation. You only have to go to the shops once if you're looking at your kitchen cupboard. So the larger the order, the lower the cost of ordering. The less times you have to order, the less times you have to transport and move things. However, if we look at the cost of holding stock, clearly if we order in small quantities, we're storing very small amounts and we're not having to invest in large storage capacities, refrigeration equipment, etc., or clean room environment for things like electronics. But if we are ordering in large quantities, the cost of holding is very high. So you can see there's a danger if you order in too large quantities that you're going to run up huge costs of holding. But if you order in too small a quantity, your danger then is that actually if you order in very small quantities, then your costs of ordering increase, because you're going to have to keep ordering and ordering, all the administration, all the transport, and so on. So of course, somewhere in the middle, there's the compromise. If we were to add the blue and the red line, cost of ordering plus cost of holding, it gives us a total cost line. And we will find that at some point, the green dotted line, there's a minimum point. This is the economic order quantity. It's ordering not too much, but not too little, just the right amount to keep the costs minimized. It's also known as the economic batch quantity, because if we're trying to decide how many items to manufacture in a batch in a factory, then clearly we don't want to keep producing very small quantities or one-offs if we have to keep resetting machines and establishing that. But we don't want to order so much that, or produce so much in huge batch sizes that we've got to store all that. So the economic batch quantity is the idea of just the right batch size to lower overall costs. And that's the theory of economic order quantity for. Okay, now what has emerged in recent years, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, has been the advance of computers. And material requirements planning is an alternative form of system that has grown really as computing power has become more affordable and higher powered. So MRP, material requirements planning, is a central mode of most commercially available production and inventory control packages. The idea is that you look forward for all your requirements for finished products, and then you break those all down into sub-assemblies, components, materials. So if you want to make, I don't know, 200 tables in your factory, you're a furniture manufacturer, and you want to make 200 tables in 1 month's time, what it does essentially is that it breaks down the table into all the sub-assemblies and components and looks at that and looks at what your total requirements are for those items. So it's almost like the ingredients list. It's suitable for items that have dependent demand. What I mean there is that independent demand is just like a supermarket. That's where customers will go in and buy independently items. They're not buying them together. There's no interrelationship between things they buy. Dependent demand would be for something like a company producing items. They have a final product, and the demand for all the sub-assemblies are dependent on how many of the final product they want to produce. Okay, how does it work? Well, it's quite straightforward. You commit yourself to a production schedule, at your final assembly plant or in your production facility. This is the plan, the production plan, as in terms of how many items you want to produce each week and when. You also have another file that works, which is called the bill of material. Bill of material effectively means the ingredients. So almost imagine you've got a recipe for cooking, because we can equate this to actual cooking, again back to the kitchen analogy. And you go through this logic as well in terms of buying items. So you will decide when you want to bake a cake or produce a meal. You will have a recipe in front of you, and on that recipe will have the ingredients. So the bill of material are all the ingredients that go to make up the final product. So for a table, it will be the legs, it will be the tabletops, and would indicate how much of each item you need. The other file that you need, which operates, is the inventory status file. This is the stock file. So if you're baking a cake, you don't just go out and buy all the materials fresh. You look in your kitchen cupboards and see whether you've still got some items. So you might have flour or currants or things like that if you're baking a cake. So you don't rush out and buy all the ingredients fresh. Anybody sensibly would have a look at what they've got first of all before they buy any more. So the idea is taking into account what you want to produce and when, breaking it down into all the ingredients, but then looking at those ingredients, those component parts, and determining, have we got these already or do we want to order some more? That's how that MRP algorithm works. I'm going to look at the algorithm in a minute. But what actually MRP produces is output reports, which tell you how much to buy and when. Okay? And clearly that gets electronically sent to your suppliers in the supply chain. So let's have a look at that table example. The master production schedule is for 200 tables in week 12. So 12 weeks ahead, we want to produce 200 tables. That's our demand production schedule. Now we want to look at the bill of material. We want to break down the tables into its constituent parts. And we're only going to consider the legs for this particular example. The bill of material tells us there's 4 legs per table. Perhaps no surprise there, but perhaps have a look at the tables that you're sitting at, because some of them don't have 4 legs. Some of them are designed differently. But we've got a fairly standard table. It's 4 legs per table. So what you do, you explode the number of legs into the gross requirements. So 200 tables means that our gross requirements, we need to have 800 legs in if we're going to final assemble those in week 12. But we don't rush out and order 800 legs, because we have a look at our inventory status and we see we've already got 350 legs in stock. So 350 legs in stock, we want 800 legs. So our net requirements are 450 legs. Okay, we've already got 350, so in this simple example, we're only going to order 450. What we then do is we don't wait until week 12 and then place the order. We have a look at the bill of materials for the leg, and that tells us that for this for these legs, there's a 3-week lead time. Okay, what that means is that it takes 3 weeks from placing the order to receiving the material, to receiving the legs. So we need to actually offset our net requirements by the lead time, and that tells us the time to initiate the purchase of the legs, if we're buying them from the supplier, is that we need to order 450 at week 9 or no later than week 9. Now, of course, this is a very simple example. It might be that we keep a safety stock of legs in stock. It might be that we don't just wait till week 9 because experience tells us we need to allow an extra safety week and perhaps buy in week 8. But you will see how the logic works. And you will see again that you probably use this logic in your own grocery shopping. You know, if you're going out, or if you're meal planning, if you're trying to be good and plan your meals for the next week and only buy what you require, this is the sort of thing that you're doing. You're looking at your material requirements and you're trying to plan those and procure the materials, you know, your food or whatever other item you're looking at in good time. Okay, now that's material requirements planning. But you may have heard of resources planning systems. There's an approach known as manufacturing resources planning, MRP2. You notice it doesn't say materials requirements planning, it's manufacturing resources planning. And then the acronym that's widely used now is enterprise resources planning. So the idea behind MRP2 is that it takes that basic MRP control that we've just looked at, how much to buy and when. It takes it a stage further by looking at the finite resources available. We want to make 200 tables in week 12, but do we have the capacity to do it? We may have to adjust our plan accordingly. And it also integrates computerized control of materials and procurement with other areas of the business. So it can link to sales, to marketing, to computer-aided design, for example, because there's the design changes, we could automatically update the bill of materials, and so on and so forth. So really, MRP2 and then enterprise resources planning is the notion of integrating all these systems together. So you may have heard of various companies like Oracle and others who provide solutions for companies, resources planning systems in how they actually manage their operations. And this is what these particular systems do. What you're learning is the sort of operation of these behind the scenes. So sometimes it's called closed loop MRP because it's actually looking at what we want to order, but then integrating it and also testing it for feasibility and so on. And you can appreciate in days gone by, computer processing power was slow. You had to do big long runs of computers just to generate a simple plan. Whereas now we can just make an adjustment and it will adjust our plans in real time. So you can sort of see with barcode control, with materials moving around the world, it will actually map the actual status of every inventory item right the way through the global supply chain. So this is what we tend to call enterprise resources planning. And you can see this sometimes as a customer, because sometimes you're able to track your orders as a consumer, just buying off companies. So you can put in your order number, if you have it, into your supplier's computer-based system, online system, and then it will track where your package is and at what stage and so on. So this is actually what's actually happening. I mean, people are even providing it as a service for their customers to track orders and so on. Okay, so resources planning is a sort of, it makes sense and is an alternative to the more traditional reorder level economic order quantity style of managing inventory. Now, what we're going to move on now is to look at what we call pull systems. And this contrasts with the traditional approach that we've just looked at. The main thing I want to say about just-in-time management is that it shifts the emphasis from optimization, which I mean cost minimization, trying to ensure the lowest cost operation and so on. But the philosophy of just-in-time is more a shift to this idea of improvement. Now, you might say, well, how does that work? Well, the idea is optimization is this sort of low cost model approach, trying to minimize and optimize our systems and our resources, whereas just in time is saying, actually, what we should be doing is concentrating on where we can make improvements, because no matter how efficient our system might be, there's always some room to do things better and more efficiently. Now, the Japanese word for continuous never-ending improvement is Kaizen. Kai meaning change, and Zen, you've probably heard of Zen in terms of relaxation and so on. It's for the better. So change for the better, improvement, Kaizen. Okay, so the just-in-time approach and Kaizen is characterized by things like total quality management. You will have heard about that from Phil in the operations and quality management lectures if you're doing that, and also the just-in-time approaches. So these sit side by side within lean Japanese approaches. The idea is here, if we look at inventory management, the implication is that rather than looking ahead into the future and trying to anticipate what our requirements will be, the idea is that in a just-in-time system, nothing is pushed through the system. Actually, operations are commenced or stock issued or ordered on a demand pull basis. So in other words, the flow of materials is regulated by usage. So as somebody uses something, that triggers the supply for some more, pulls through more material. You can even see this happening in supermarkets such as Tesco. The barcode is not just for pricing, it's also for the inventory systems. As you buy something at the till, it reduces the inventory levels. When it sort of reduces down, the idea is that purchase of items triggers a lowering the stock and then will automatically pull through items that are required. And this is what's known as a Kanban system. In Japanese, Kanban really means to see something and then do it. Something happens and you do it, Kanban. It effectively means that there's triggers in the system. You know, as things are used, as the levels run down, whenever necessary, there's a triggering, a pulling of items to reorder. Okay, so you're not looking ahead into the future, you're just pulling items through your supply chain based upon the usage. This means that you're not building up excessive stocks and inventories. But of course, there is a problem with this, that if demand is very high and unpredictable, you can be caught with no stock in the system. So the secret is how you balance this through. So the idea behind just in time is to pull through your requirements and your inventory, don't push. Okay, so just in time management attacks and seeks to reduce things, because remember, it's all about improvement. It questions the cost of ordering. Should we be buying off a closer supplier? Should we be cutting down the costs of ordering? Could it be automatic, and so on? Lead times and setup times. You know, why do we have to accept 3-week lead times? Why can't we do things quicker? Holding costs, you know, are there ways in which we can reduce those? Maybe get our suppliers to hold the inventory for us on our behalf. That's vendor managed inventory that we're going to be looking at later on. And any other problems that occur. So just in time, it's all about reducing stocks. It's trying to think about where just in time can be applied and to what level. It's about also not removing all the stock out of the system. This is where people get it wrong. It's about ensuring we run with a minimal amount so that we can still pull material through to satisfy demand, but not run up high costs. So it's all a balancing act again. And it's all about demand pull as well. So that slide is there if you want to just pause and look at that for a while. Okay, a good way of thinking about how just-in-time works is to think about it as a sea of inventory. And this was put forward by a Japanese writer called Shingo. And he said, think about your inventory and stock levels almost like a water level. There's a stock level, and think about it as a sea or a level of water. You might say in this analogy that the ship, the yacht there, is sailing along on the surface at the level. There's no problems. There's rocks underneath the surface. Those rocks are problems such as unreliable supplier deliveries, defective components, poorly coordinated processes in this case. But it looks as if it's running fine. But a just-in-time advocate would say that is holding excessive stocks. We should try and gradually lower down the level and improve our stock holding, reduce down the amount. Obviously, when you lower the water level down to level 2, the problem is the biggest problem sticks out, unreliable supply deliveries. But the notion is here, and this is how it links with total quality management, is that you then tackle that biggest problem. That problem surfaces first of all. And so you try and tackle that, perhaps buy off different suppliers, perhaps work with your suppliers for more efficient delivery, perhaps get them to locate closer to your factory. All sorts of solutions can be tackled to improve the situation. If you can explode and remove that rock altogether, or at least lower it down, that means you can then operate at level 2. But of course, just in time doesn't stop there. The idea is that you then lower the inventory level down again until the next problem surfaces, the next biggest problem. So this is about continuous improvement, slowly lowering the water level. Where people have failed with just-in-time is that they've gone straight to just-in-time, removed all the inventory out of the system, and you can see in our analogy what would happen if you went from level 1 down to level 4 is that you would have a shipwreck on your hands, because actually you've lowered the inventory without tackling the problems, and so clearly you're going to run out of inventory because you haven't tackled those particular issues. Okay, so it's this gradual lowering and enabling in order the largest problems to surface first of all. So I hope that that's useful for thinking about how this operates. Okay, now, as I said, the idea of a pool control system or just-in-time system is that you use Kanban. And the Kanban is the idea, is the triggering device. Originally developed at Toyota, it was actually a fairly physical type of system. What it does, it sort of ensures that if there are things that operate differently or cause dislocation and so on, the system then adjusts the inventory flow and the ordering system dependent on the changes that are going on. So it's a sort of a management system which sort of monitors stock levels, monitors other issues, and tries to ensure that material just flows through as and when required, pulled through on usage need. Okay, let's have a look at how Toyota originally introduced the Kanban. And we're going to drop right to the level of individual workstations in a factory, just to show you how Toyota used it. So we have a workstation, it might just be a person working at a bench, and we have a second workstation. And the flow of material goes from one station to the next in the direction of the red arrow. Okay, so what happens is that the material is placed in a container, and that container moves from workstation 1 full of material that's required at workstation 2. When workstation 2 uses that container, it then requires some more. So the use, once they've emptied that container of materials, of components at workstation 2, they will need some more of the material to keep them operating. So that sets up the demand pull. And the way in which this is done is that they send the empty container back. So the full container moves forward, but then once the material is used, once the items are used, the demand or the order, if you want to supply some more, is that they send the empty back. And when workstation 1 sees an empty, it then refills that and supplies it forward. Now this seems very simple, but if you think about it, you can control the total amount of inventory in the system by the number of containers that you have. Okay, and also this doesn't just have to be a container. It could be that you just send back something like a little Kanban card or something similar to that. Or these days, of course, we have barcodes and QR codes and so on, which really workstation 2 very often will send something back or electronically order some more, usage at one point. And if it's materials tracking, it can even do it automatically, that the material has been used at one station and it puts a pull back earlier. So the example I use at Tesco, for example, is that the shop, you could think of the shop as being workstation 2, the supermarket itself, and usage of, say, baked beans has run to a particular level, and when it hits a level, electronically the pull goes back to the warehouse, a more central warehouse, to supply more to the store. And so that's how that actually operates, to ensure that you keep as minimal a stock as you can. This could also work between customers and suppliers, different organizations. So pulling things through. Toyota works with its suppliers in this way. And of course, it can operate internationally as well. So our example here is just at the level between two workstations, but it could be between international customer and international supplier, crossing boundaries. Okay, so that's the principle of just-in-time system. There are advantages. I've listed some down there. You can read about these more if you want. I mean, the main advantage is lower stock, hopefully responsive response to demand and so on. But there are some disadvantages. Very risky when you first introduce it. Remember not to lower the water level, the stock level, too low at start. You know, get this basic system operating first of all before you seek to try and reduce stocks. You know, some people say often it works a lot better for sort of high volume, stable production than for sort of small scale or erratic demand, and that's certainly true. But these are some of the things that we need to be thinking of there. Okay, so just in time, widely used now in international supply. There's some of the things it demands. It relies on suppliers, so we rely on close partnerships because supply is very much needs to be reliable, needs to be of high quality. Because we're running with low stocks, we can't have defects or faulty materials, because that means then that you can't respond to demand correctly. And so we hear a lot about partnerships and people working together to tackle issues. There's often pressure on the whole supply chain to adopt it. If we have a sort of somebody downstream, final assembly using it, very often people have to adopt it going further back. But you know, the idea of this is that you're trying to improve and lower stock and produce a more flexible, responsive system. And also, the argument of just-in-time is that it gives you a more efficient customer response. So people such as Amazon would argue that they don't just run a very efficient low stock service, but it's extremely responsive, flexible, and delivers at high speed. Sometimes, you know, what we tend to call this today is agile supply. So that's really where just-in-time comes and settles in. I was going to say relies on suppliers. It's not just in terms of reliability and quality, but also partnerships needed, because often your computer systems, or always your computer systems now, have to be integrated together. So it needs that real information sharing and integration of systems that you have. Okay, just a final point here is that there are instances where people use vendor managed inventory these days. So instead of you as the customer or the organization procuring material, buying in material and storing it in goods in wood or wherever, the idea is that your supplier manages the items, stores it and manages the flow. And essentially what you do as a customer is just call off items as and when you want it. Now the idea is that this is more efficient because it holds material further upstream, therefore lowers costs, therefore looks more like just in time. So the supplier sort of issues the material, but of course you need to have lots of information sharing, as I've said before, that the customer has to provide information on points of sales, on demand, on points of use, and so on. The argument for vendor managed inventory is that it leads to reduced inventory for both parties, therefore lowering costs on the basic model that we looked at before, economic order quantity. The advantages are the customer has less risk, reduced cost, improved cash flow, because that's really what we're looking at here. For the supplier, you might say, well, wait a minute, they have all the costs put on them. But the argument is that it ties them into a longer term relationship, a secure relationship and partnership with their customers. So this is where it sort of bonds people together. Partnerships and relationships are really important in international supply chains these days. Essentially what it means is that rather than the customer just going for always the lowest cost supplier and swapping and changing suppliers. It ties the supplier and the customer in together, and gives the supplier more security and more of a guarantee of business going forward into the future. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. What I've tried to do is talk through basic inventory management theory, and we're really trying to talk about the controlled movement of inventory through the supply chain. And as it says there, bullet point 2, controlled inventory management and planning equates to effective operational management of the supply chain. If you don't have that in today's world, you're going to have serious problems, because it's going to be, your cost base is going to be too high, and you won't have the agility and flexibility to respond quickly and effectively to your customers' and consumers' demands. We've covered inventory policy and practice. I've talked through conventional economic order quantity and economic batch quantity theory and practice, equating it to how you might run your kitchen cupboards. And then I've also added on the requirements planning and resources planning approach, which is widely used, the computer systems and so on. What you find now is that ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, is well developed in concept. Implementation can be very complex and difficult in practice, but many of the top organizations are there now with integrated systems through their global supply chains, monitoring things coming through the system and planning that. It's interesting because when we look at just-in-time management, it can look at, sometimes people contrast it and say, well, it's a pull system, it operates in a different way. But actually what we say, what I always say, is that actually ERP, you do need a degree of push, because you need to plan in some way going forward into the future. So your resources planning system anticipates what the demand's likely to be. But the idea of just-in-time and pull and Kanbans is that triggers the flow at the operational level. In other words, rather than just committing yourself to pushing items through, just-in-time regulates the flow based upon the actual demand. Okay, so a combination of push and pull is really best practice these days. Push in terms of your longer term planning, but in terms of the day-to-day operational demand, when demand occurs or when an order is placed, that should just pull through the requirements as and when needed. Okay, I hope that you found this lecture interesting. Some people find this a difficult lecture and a very technical lecture, but if you've understood what I've talked about, you've understood the theory behind international global supply chains and how inventory management is managed in general terms. Obviously there's a lot more detail than this. Now all of this links very nicely to the next lecture, because the next lecture will look more critically at the buyer-supplier relationship. And what we do find today, that in managing the inventory and managing the movement of materials through the global supply chain, it's really important that we manage our supplier relationships well, and in many instances look towards developing longer-term partnerships to make everything work. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture. I say this lecture was done in case I wasn't able to deliver the lecture in person, but I hope that you found it useful, and by all means contact me if you need to know more about this.